The Merry Widow's Dark Secret, a Miss Marple mystery. The morning dress had been altered. That was the detail. Inside the left seam, the kind of place only a seamstress or a detective would look, the ticket from Harlow and Briggs of the High Street bore a date, the 14th of March. Colonel Fairweather had been found dead on the 2nd of April. 18 days separated those two dates. A woman does not commission a black crepe morning dress nearly 3 weeks before her husband has died. Not unless she is very cold or very certain. Mrs. Constance Fairweather had wept beautifully at the funeral. Everyone said so. Welcome to Marple Mysteries, where in the quietest English villages the most careful secrets are undone by the smallest things. Tonight we visit the parish of Ashenfield, where a widow's grief is quite convincing, and her wardrobe rather too prepared. This is the Merry Widow's Dark Secret. Chapter 1. The Dress and the Village. The village of Ashenfield had not produced a scandal in 11 years, not since the business with the churchwarden's missing organ fund, which had ultimately been explained, if not entirely forgiven. It sat in the fold of two low hills in the Cotswolds. The sort of village that appeared on railway posters and calendars, all honey-coloured stone and climbing roses, with a duck pond that froze picturesquely every January, and a post office that doubled as a lending library on Tuesday afternoons. It was precisely the sort of village in which nothing was supposed to happen. Colonel Reginald Fairweather had retired to Ashenfield 4 years ago with his wife Constance, and a moderate fortune assembled through 40 years of prudent investment and, as the village suspected but could not prove, a rather immoderate talent for knowing when to sell. He had been 63, upright and quiet in the manner of men who have learned that most conversation is unnecessary. He had walked his spaniel, Gilbert, each morning at 7:30, taken a single whisky before dinner, and attended St. Botolph's on Sundays without visible enthusiasm. He had not, by any account, been a man anyone expected to die of anything but great age. He was found on the morning of the 2nd of April, seated in his study armchair, with a copy of the Times folded to the crossword on his knee, and an expression of complete composure on his face. The local physician, Dr. Alwyn Price, had noted heart failure without undue surprise, and the colonel had carried a mild arrhythmia for 2 years. The body had shown no disturbance, no sign of struggle. The whisky glass on the side table had been empty. Everything was orderly. Everything was entirely as it should be. The village, accordingly, grieved in the moderate way it reserved for those it had respected but not especially loved. Mrs. Constance Fairweather grieved rather more visibly. She was 47 to her husband's 63, a handsome woman with pale red hair, and the kind of figure that causes the wives of Ashenfield to take mental inventory of their own. She had wept at the graveside with restrained dignity, accepted condolences in the front parlour of Fairweather House with genuine-seeming warmth, and sent handwritten notes to each of the 22 households who had sent flowers. The village on the whole found her admirable. It was Mrs. Doris Brent, of the lending library, who had first noticed the dress. She had not, of course, framed it as a suspicion. She had mentioned it to her sister-in-law, Patricia, as an observation. Patricia had mentioned it to her neighbour, Mr. Fawcett, as a mild curiosity. Mr. Fawcett had not mentioned it to anyone, but had thought about it for 3 days before concluding that it troubled him in a way he could not precisely identify, and therefore preferred to ignore. The information had reached Miss Jane Marple, by a more direct route. Mrs. Brent's sister-in-law, Patricia, happened to be the second cousin of Mrs. Plimpton, whose gardener's wife attended the same church auxiliary as Miss Marple in St. Mary Mead. It had arrived attached to a lemon sponge, and the general observation that Ashenfield was a very interesting village these days. Miss Marple had been visiting her old friend, Mrs. Clara Avery, in Ashenfield for 4 days. She had come ostensibly for the spring air, and to see Clara's new garden wall, which had taken 18 months to build, and was, by Clara's account, something of a triumph. She had brought her knitting. She had admired the wall thoroughly and without hurry. She had attended morning service at St. Botolph's and introduced herself to no one of consequence. She had, however, noticed the dress at the funeral reception. She had not been looking for it. But there are certain things a woman of Miss Marple's particular experience notices without trying. The quality of a fabric, the cut of a collar, the precise shade of black that comes from a new garment, as opposed to one retrieved from storage. The dress Mrs. Fairweather had worn to receive condolences was new, not recently pressed, not carefully maintained, new. The crepe had that particular resistance at the sleeve that vanishes after a first laundering. The hem fell with the stiffness of a garment not yet broken into the body that wore it. Miss Marple had said nothing. She had accepted her cup of tea, remarked on the excellent seed cake to a woman whose name she had not yet learned, and observed Mrs. Constance Fairweather for 23 minutes. The widow had grieved. She had not, Miss Marple noticed, flinched. There is a difference between sadness and performance, and it is not always the one you expect. Genuinely bereaved women sometimes laugh at inappropriate moments, and they sometimes speak too loudly, or eat with appetite, or forget to look mournful when they think no one is watching. Mrs. Fairweather did none of these things. She was consistent. She was precise. Her grief moved at exactly the pace that grief was supposed to move, in the setting in which it was being observed. It was, Miss Marple reflected, walking home to Clara's through the apple blossom lane, remarkably like watching someone follow a stage direction. She picked up her knitting when she arrived. Clara made cocoa. "What did you make of her?" Clara asked, because Clara knew her well enough to know she had made something. "I'm not sure yet," Miss Marple said, which was true. She thought about the dress. She thought about the date on that tag. She thought about a woman she had known in St. Mary Mead 30 years ago, a Mrs. Goddard, who had planted Lily of the Valley the autumn before her husband fell down the garden stairs in February. The lilies had been in full bloom for the funeral. Miss Marple counted her stitches. Outside, the evening was very still. Chapter 2. The seamstress remembers. Harlow and Briggs occupied the narrow premises between the chemist and a shop selling walking sticks and watercolours to tourists who passed through Ashenfield in summer and forgot it entirely by October. The sign above the door was painted in dark green with gold lettering, the kind of lettering that communicates longevity without needing to mention it. A small bell rang when the door was opened. The interior smelled of chalk and warm wool, and the particular stillness of a place that does serious work. Miss Marple entered at 10:20 on a Thursday morning, which she had selected with care. Thursday mornings, in her experience, were when the second seamstress took her half-day and the proprietress was likely to be alone. She was correct. Mrs. Edna Harlow, Briggs having been a business partner who retired in 1951 and was retained on the sign for the weight of tradition, was a compact woman of perhaps 60, with the excellent posture of someone who has spent decades telling other women to stand up straight. She wore a tape measure around her neck like a clerical collar. She looked at Miss Marple with the particular professional assessment of a woman who has spent her career understanding what people want before they say it. "Good morning," said Miss Marple. "I wonder if I might speak with you about a small matter. Nothing requiring your professional services, I'm afraid, though I shall certainly keep you in mind. My friend Mrs. Avery has told me your work is quite exceptional." Mrs. Harlow acknowledged this with the restrained pleasure of someone who hears it often and still values it. "Of course. How can I help?" Miss Marple settled into the small chair provided for waiting customers and arranged her handbag on her lap with the air of someone who intends to stay precisely as long as necessary and not a moment longer. "I was at Colonel Fairweather's funeral reception last week," she said. "A sad business. I couldn't help but admire Mrs. Fairweather's dress. I wondered whether it was yours." There was a pause, brief but present. "It was," said Mrs. Harlow. "Beautiful crepe," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I thought so at once. You can always tell quality by how it falls at the sleeve." Mrs. Harlow said nothing. She was folding a length of grey flannel with the concentrated attention of a woman who has decided to be very busy with her hands. "I imagine it must require some notice," Miss Marple continued, in the same gentle, unhurried tone she used when talking about the weather. "That quality of work, one can't have it done in a day." "We ask for 10 days minimum," said Mrs. Harlow. "For mourning, we try to accommodate more quickly when circumstances arise suddenly." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "Though in this case there was, I suppose, rather more time." The folding stopped. Mrs. Harlow turned. She was not a woman given to visible agitation. Her face held the trained steadiness of someone accustomed to discretion. But there was something in the set of her mouth that had shifted. Not guilt precisely, closer to the expression of a person who has been waiting for a question and is not entirely relieved that it has arrived. I'm sorry, I don't believe I caught your name." "Marple," said Miss Marple. "Jane Marple. I'm staying with Mrs. Avery on Church Lane." "Mrs. Marple." A small pause. "The dress was commissioned on the 14th of March." "Yes," said Miss Marple simply, as though this confirmed nothing more than a pleasantry. "Mrs. Fairweather said it was for a function in London," said Mrs. Harlow. "A memorial service for a friend of her husband's. She said she'd had nothing suitable, and her London dressmaker was behind." She smoothed the flannel with one careful hand. "I had no reason to—" "Of course not," said Miss Marple warmly. "Oh, none whatsoever." The silence that followed was of the companionable sort that is not companionable at all. "She came in twice for fittings," Mrs. Harlow said after a moment. "Quietly now." The voice of a woman who has been deciding whether to say something for 10 days and has just decided. "The second fitting was the 22nd of March. She was particular about the cut, very specific. She knew exactly what she wanted." "As a woman of her taste would be," said Miss Marple. "She brought a photograph," said Mrs. Harlow, "for reference, which is not unusual, but it was—" She stopped. Then, choosing her words with the care of someone who has spent a professional lifetime measuring things precisely. "It was a photograph of a funeral, from a magazine. She said she admired the cut of the dress in it. I altered the collar to match." Miss Marple looked at her knitting bag, though she had not taken the knitting out. "Did she seem, would you say, distressed?" During the fittings? Mrs. Harlow considered this with the seriousness it deserved. She seemed, she said at last, very organised. Miss Marple thanked her, declined the offer of tea, and left the shop at 23 minutes to 11. The bell rang again behind her. She stood for a moment on the pavement in the thin April sunshine. A woman who brings a magazine photograph of a funeral dress to a fitting 18 days before her husband dies is either remarkably prescient or remarkably deliberate. In Miss Marple's experience, coincidences of that precise calibration were rare. They required, as a rule, a certain amount of advance planning. She thought again of Mrs. Goddard and the lily of the valley. Then she walked at her usual unhurried pace toward Dr. Alwyn Price's surgery on the far end of the High Street, because the second question, the more important question, was not about the dress at all. It was about the whiskey. Chapter 3. The Doctor's Detail. Dr. Alwyn Price's surgery occupied the ground floor of a Georgian townhouse at the quieter end of Ashenfield High Street, separated from the post office by a solicitor's office and a gap where a bakery had stood until 1947. The waiting room held 4 chairs, a rubber plant of considerable age, and a stack of magazines that had not been refreshed since the previous autumn. Miss Marple noted a copy of Country Life from September, and sat beneath it without complaint. She had not made an appointment. This was deliberate. Doctors with appointments see patients. Doctors without appointments, in Miss Marple's experience, are slightly off balance, hospitable in the way of people who have been surprised into courtesy and have not yet decided how much of it to extend. Dr. Price appeared at 11:05. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 42, with the slightly harried look of a country physician who has too many patients and not quite enough Thursday afternoons. He had good hands. She noticed that first. The hands of a man who had trained carefully and still took the work seriously. "Miss Marple?" He had checked with his receptionist. "Of course. I don't believe we've met." "We haven't," she said pleasantly. "I'm staying with Clara Avery on Church Lane. I won't take much of your time. I had a small question, rather an odd one, I'm afraid, about Colonel Fairweather." Something moved behind his eyes. Not alarm, something more considered than that. "Perhaps you'd like to come through," he said. His consulting room was orderly in the manner of a man who imposes order as a discipline rather than a preference. The desk held a single folder, closed. On the wall behind him was a framed certificate and a small watercolour of the Cornish coast that looked as though someone who loved him had given it to him, and he had hung it out of loyalty rather than taste. Miss Marple sat. Dr. Price sat. He did not ask what she did or why she was interested. She noted that too. "You signed the death certificate," she said, not a question. "I did. Cardiac arrest secondary to existing arrhythmia. The Colonel had been under my care for 2 years. His condition was, not unexpected, here's an eventual outcome." "No," said Miss Marple, "though the timing perhaps was." Dr. Price looked at her steadily. "He was 63. Men with his condition—" "Quite," said Miss Marple. "I wondered about the whiskey glass, on the side table, when he was found." A pause. Short, but not nothing. "What about it?" "Was it tested?" she asked. "The residue, I mean. I imagine in cases of natural death there would be no particular reason. There was no reason to suspect anything other than natural death," said Dr. Price. His voice had taken on a careful, even quality. The voice of a man choosing each word, the way you choose a step on uncertain ground. "No," said Miss Marple, "there wouldn't have been. That is rather the point, isn't it?" She let that sit for a moment, the way she let her knitting sit when a row required thinking about. I knew a man in St. Mary Mead, she said in the ruminative tone she adopted when she was in fact being extremely precise. A retired solicitor. Very healthy man, really. Strong constitution. He died quite suddenly one February, seated in his chair, very composed, no sign of struggle. His physician recorded heart failure. It was 3 years before anyone thought to look at the port decanter on his sideboard. She smoothed her skirt. I don't say that has any bearing here whatsoever. Dr. Price said nothing for a long moment. Then, the glass was empty when I arrived. Rinsed, I believe. The housekeeper said she'd tidied before realizing she oughtn't to have. There was nothing to test. Miss Marple looked up. Rinsed. The housekeeper said she tidied automatically, and before she understood the situation. Which housekeeper? Said Miss Marple. Mrs. Fairweather's housekeeper, or the Colonel's? They shared one, said Dr. Price. And Mrs. Tanner. She's been with the household 6 years. Miss Marple considered this, and Mrs. Tanner found the body. Mrs. Fairweather found the body. Mrs. Tanner was called in afterward. He stopped. He was looking at his desk now, at the closed folder, in the manner of a man reviewing a sequence of events that he has previously reviewed alone and not been entirely satisfied with. She said she tidied the glass out of habit. I saw no reason to disbelieve her. Of course not, said Miss Marple gently. She's been there 6 years. Quite trustworthy, I imagine. Very, said Dr. Price. Then, unquietly, Miss Marple, what exactly is it you're suggesting? Nothing at all, she said with complete sincerity. I'm simply an old woman who notices small things. It is an unfortunate habit. She rose, retrieving her bag. I wonder, purely out of curiosity, whether the Colonel had adjusted his will at any point in the year before he died. Dr. Price blinked. That's not something a physician would— No, she agreed. Quite right. You wouldn't know that. I shall have to ask someone else. She paused at the door. One last thing. The arrhythmia, was it the sort that progresses predictably? Or the sort that can be, shall we say, encouraged? The silence that followed was the longest of the conversation. I would need, Dr. Price said at last, very quietly, to speak with a colleague. Miss Marple thanked him and showed herself out. On the pavement, the April sun had strengthened slightly. She walked the length of the high street at her usual pace, thinking about housekeepers who tidy out of habit, and glasses rinsed before anyone thinks to question them, and the precise window of time between a woman finding her husband dead and a woman calling for help. It was, she thought, a very small window. But windows that small are almost never accidental. She turned toward the solicitor's office she had passed on the way in. Mr. Gale and Partners. Established 1903. The Colonel, she suspected, had been a careful man. Careful men updated their wills. Chapter 4. The Altered Will. Mr. Gale and Partners occupied a set of rooms that had not been meaningfully redecorated since the firm's establishment and were not apologetic about it. The walls were panelled in dark oak. The carpet was the colour of dried mustard, and had been worn to a comfortable thinness in the precise paths between door and desk that suggested decades of the same anxious footsteps. A clerk of indeterminate age sat behind a counter and looked at Miss Marple with the expression of a man whose primary professional function was the discouragement of unscheduled visits. I don't have an appointment, said Miss Marple pleasantly, but I wonder if Mr. Gale might spare 5 minutes. It concerns the Fairweather estate. The clerk's expression shifted by approximately 2 degrees toward interest. In a village the size of Ashenfield, the Fairweather estate was not a small matter. He disappeared through a door and returned shortly to indicate that Mr. Gale would see her. Mr. Gale was 70 if he was a day, with the deliberate movements of a man who has learned that haste produces errors, and errors produce consequences. He had white hair, a dark suit of excellent age, and the eyes of someone who has spent 50 years listening to what people do not say. He stood when she entered, which she appreciated, and gestured to the chair opposite his desk, which was buried under organized stacks of paper in the manner of a man whose system makes sense only to himself. "Miss Marple," he said, "Clara Avery's friend. You know Mrs. Avery?" "I know everyone in Ashenfield," he said without vanity. "Simply as fact. She mentioned you were visiting. Sit down, please." Miss Marple sat. She placed her bag on her lap and did not immediately speak, which was itself a kind of question. In her experience, solicitors and silences had a complicated relationship. They used silence professionally, and therefore were more sensitive to it than most. Mr. Gale said, "I imagine this is about Reginald." "It is," she said. "I won't pretend otherwise. I understand you were his solicitor." "For 21 years? Then you drew up his will." "I drew up several versions of it," said Mr. Gale carefully. He had folded his hands on the desk with the precise deliberateness of a man deciding how much professional discretion the moment required. "Miss Marple, I must ask what your interest is. You are not, as I understand it, connected to the family." "No," she said. "I am simply an observant old woman who is troubled by a dress." She paused. "And a rinsed whiskey glass, and a housekeeper's reflexive tidying, and a death certificate signed without adequate pause." Another pause. "I am Mr. Gale. Troubled by the general smoothness of it all." Mr. Gale looked at her for a long moment. His expression did not change, precisely, but something behind it settled. The way a house settles after a long winter, a slight shift, an old tension releasing. "Reginald came to me 11 months before he died," he said, "the 14th of May. He wanted to amend his will." Miss Marple waited. His previous will, drawn up in 2019 shortly after their marriage, left the entirety of the estate to his wife Constance, with a secondary bequest to his daughter from his first marriage, a Miss Patricia Fairweather, who lives in Edinburgh. Mr. Gale paused. The amendment removed Constance as primary beneficiary, and added, "Patricia became sole primary beneficiary. Constance was reduced to a lifetime annuity, comfortable but fixed, and the house was to be sold. The investment portfolio was to pass entirely to Patricia." He said this in the even tone of a man who delivers difficult information as a professional duty. It was a significant change. "It was," said Miss Marple. "Did he say why?" "He said," Mr. Gale chose his words with the same precision Mrs. Harlow had used about the dress. The precision, Miss Marple thought, of people who know their words may eventually matter in a formal setting. "He said he had reason to reconsider his confidence in the marriage. He did not elaborate. I did not press. It is not my function to press." "No," said Miss Marple. "Did Mrs. Fairweather know?" "Reginald said he had not told her. He intended to, when the time was right." A pause. "He did not, apparently, find the right time." "Or the time did not find him," said Miss Marple quietly. Mr. Gale looked at the window. Outside, the High Street continued its mild Thursday business. A woman with a pram, a delivery van, 2 men talking outside the post office with their hands in their pockets. The unremarkable machinery of ordinary life. The will as amended has not yet been submitted to probate," he said. "Mrs. Fairweather has not yet instructed a solicitor to proceed, which is not unusual at this stage of bereavement." "But she has been in contact with you?" "She came in last week." He smoothed the edge of a paper on his desk. "She asked in general terms about the estate, about timelines. She seemed to assume the original will was in effect." He paused. "Yeah, I told her the estate was in order, and that we would be in contact in due course." "You did not correct her assumption." "I told her nothing inaccurate," said Mr. Gale. He met her eyes directly. "I am, however, increasingly of the opinion that certain matters may require closer scrutiny before probate proceeds." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I rather think they may." She rose. At the door she turned, as had become something of a habit in Ashenfield. "Patricia Fairweather in Edinburgh. Has she been notified of the amended will?" "I wrote to her the day after the funeral," said Mr. Gale. "She telephoned me on the following Tuesday. She is travelling to Ashenfield at the end of this week." Miss Marple considered this. "I imagine," she said, "that Mrs. Fairweather does not know that." "No," said Mr. Gale. "She does not." Miss Marple thanked him and went out into the April afternoon. The sun was warmer now, the kind of warmth that arrives without warning in English spring and makes everything look temporarily innocent. She walked without hurrying, turning the sequence of facts over with the same methodical patience she applied to a complicated pattern row. A dress commissioned too early, a glass rinsed too promptly, a will altered and concealed, and now a stepdaughter travelling south, carrying knowledge that a widow did not know she possessed. The week, Miss Marple thought, was about to become considerably less smooth. She turned toward Church Lane and Mrs. Avery's garden and the cocoa that would be waiting, and thought carefully about what to do before Patricia Fairweather arrived. Chapter 5. The Posted Letter. Patricia Fairweather arrived on a Friday afternoon by the 2:15 from Oxford, which deposited her at the small station 3 miles outside Ashenfield, with one leather suitcase, a mackintosh over her arm, and the particular expression of someone who has been bracing themselves for something unpleasant, and has not yet decided whether the reality will be worse than the anticipation. Miss Marple was not at the station. She had, however, suggested to Clara Avery, who was a member of the church auxiliary, the parish council, and the committee responsible for the village fete, which is to say she knew everything that moved through Ashenfield within approximately 4 hours of its arrival, that Patricia might benefit from a friendly face. Clara had arranged for Mrs. Brent's nephew to collect her in his motor, and had, with characteristic efficiency, invited Patricia to tea at Church Lane before she proceeded to Fairweather House. Miss Marple was in the sitting-room with her knitting when they arrived. Patricia Fairweather was 38, with her father's straight posture and quiet eyes, and the colouring of a woman who has spent several years in a northern city and made peace with it. She was not pretty in the way that draws immediate attention, but she had the kind of face that becomes more interesting the longer one looks at it, which Miss Marple considered the superior arrangement. She shook hands firmly, accepted tea without fuss, and looked around Clara's sitting-room with the careful attention of someone storing information rather than admiring decor. "Mr. and Gale said you'd been asking questions," she said to Miss Marple after the first cup, "not accusatory, factual." "I have been noticing things," said Miss Marple, "which is a different activity, though it tends toward the same destination." Patricia looked at her steadily. "You think she killed him?" Clara made a small sound and attended very closely to the teapot. "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that several details do not arrange themselves comfortably into the shape of a natural death. Whether they arrange themselves into anything else is a question that requires more than an old woman's observations." "It requires evidence," said Patricia. "It does." Patricia set down her cup, and she opened the mackintosh she had kept across her lap throughout, a gesture Miss Marple had noted and not commented on, and removed from the inside pocket an envelope. It was a standard white envelope, slightly worn at the corners from handling, addressed in a firm masculine hand to Miss P. Fairweather, 14 Inverleith Terrace, Edinburgh. The postmark read the 30th of March. The Colonel had died on the 2nd of April. She placed it on the table between them. "He posted this 3 days before he died," she said. "I received it on the 3rd, after he was already gone." Miss Marple did not reach for it. "Would you read it to us?" Patricia unfolded the letter. 2 pages, written on both sides in the same firm hand as the envelope, although the letters toward the end of the second page were slightly less regular, the writing of a man who was tired or troubled or both. She read, "Dear Patricia, I am writing this rather than telephoning because I want to be precise, and I find I am not as precise as I once was when I speak these days. I have been tired. I want you to know I have seen Gail, and the matter we discussed in January is settled as I intended. You will find things are in order when the time comes, though I hope the time is not yet. I have also been thinking about the whiskey. You will think this is a strange thing to write about. I have been having one measure each evening before dinner for 30 years, and I have lately been finding that one measure makes me more tired than it used to. I mentioned this to Price, and he said it was my age. Perhaps it is, but I have been a precise man about quantities for 30 years, and a precise measure of whiskey does not suddenly exhaust a man who has always been steady. I am not writing to alarm you. I am writing because you are a sensible woman, and you know your own mind, and if anything should happen, I want there to be a record that I noticed this, and that I was not imagining it. I am 63, and not unwell beyond what I have always been unwell. I do not wish to seem dramatic. I simply think it is better to say a thing than not to say it. Your stepmother and I have not been easy together this past year. I expect you know something of that. There is no need to discuss it. I have taken the steps I felt were necessary. Come down in the summer if you can manage it. Gilbert is getting old and would be pleased to see you. Your father." Patricia folded the letter along its original creases. She did this slowly and without looking up, the movements of someone who has performed this action many times in the past 2 weeks, and has not yet found it easier. The sitting room was very quiet. Outside, a blackbird was conducting a vigorous argument with something in Clara's apple tree. "The whiskey," said Miss Marple. "Yes." He noticed it himself. He was precise about the quantity. "He measured it," said Patricia, "exactly 1½ measures every evening. He had a small mark on the decanter. He'd done it since his 30s. She paused. "He said it kept him honest." Miss Marple thought about the empty glass, the rinsed glass, Mrs. Tanner tidying automatically, the very small window of time between discovery and the calling for help. Something was being added, she said, and not a question. "Gradually," said Patricia. "That's what I think, not enough at once to be obvious. Enough, over time, to weaken a heart that was already unreliable." She said this in the even tone of someone who has arrived at a conclusion through a great deal of pain, and has come out the other side into something colder and more useful than grief. Price wouldn't have looked for it, There was no reason to look. "There is now," said Miss Marple. "I've already spoken to a solicitor in Edinburgh," said Patricia, "and a pharmacologist. There are substances, certain cardiac glycosides, digitalis compounds, that would not be detected in a routine examination. That would look precisely like the natural progression of an existing condition." She looked at Miss Marple directly. "They would require a post-mortem, a specific one, which requires sufficient grounds for the authorities to order it," said Miss Marple. "Yes. The letter is grounds," said Miss Marple, "combined with the dress, the glass, and the will." She paused. "It is not yet enough, but it is no longer nothing." Patricia looked at the envelope on the table. "She doesn't know the will was changed. She doesn't know I'm here, and she doesn't know about the letter." "No," said Miss Marple. "At present, she knows none of those things." She picked up her knitting and examined the row she had reached with the mild attention of a woman considering her next stitch. "I wonder whether we might allow one of them to change." Patricia waited. "Mrs. Fairweather," said Miss Marple, "is a woman who plans carefully and acts when she believes herself safe, and the most productive thing we can do is to make her feel, quite precisely, unsafe, and then watch very carefully what she does next." Outside, the blackbird had won its argument. The garden was quiet. The afternoon light had gone the particular deep gold of early English evening, the kind that makes everything look settled and permanent and entirely undisturbed. Miss Marple counted her stitches. She was not, she thought, quite finished yet. Chapter 6. The Careful Disturbance. The instrument Miss Marple selected was Mrs. Doris Brent. This was not accidental. Mrs. Brent was not malicious. Miss Marple was particular about that distinction. Malicious people spread information with an agenda attached, which corrupts the information and makes the recipient defensive. If Brent spread information the way a reliable post office delivers letters, promptly, completely, and without editorial interference. She was, in the technical sense Miss Marple required, a perfect conductor. She called on her Saturday morning, ostensibly to return a recipe for gooseberry preserve that Clara had borrowed the previous autumn and only just located. Mrs. Brent received her in the kitchen, which was warm and smelled of toast, and they spoke for 22 minutes about nothing in particular, before Miss Marple mentioned, in the ruminative tone of someone simply thinking aloud, that she had met Patricia Fairweather at Clara's the previous afternoon. "The daughter?" said Mrs. Brent immediately. "Stepdaughter," said Miss Marple. "From Edinburgh. Quite a composed young woman. She's come down to speak with Mr. Gale about the estate. I believe," she paused, folding her hands in her lap, "she brought some of her father's correspondence, letters he'd sent her recently. Apparently, he'd been writing to her quite regularly these past few months." Mrs. Brent's attention sharpened in the way of a woman who understands instinctively the weight of that last sentence. "Recently." "Just before he died," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "She seemed to find it a great comfort, having his own words, you know, in his own hand." Another pause, light as a feather. Mr. Gale seemed very interested in them as well. She left shortly afterward, thanked Mrs. Brent for the tea, and walked home to Clara's along the lane, where the hawthorn was coming into blossom, and the morning was still and bright. She did not hurry. There was no need to hurry. The information of that precise composition, a stepdaughter, a solicitor, letters and interest, would reach Constance Fairweather within the day, probably before lunch. The question was what Constance Fairweather would do with it. Miss Marple had considered 3 possibilities. The first was nothing, the response of a woman either innocent or supremely controlled, who calculated that any movement would draw more attention than stillness. The second was contact. An approach to Patricia, warm and careful, the performance of a stepmother's grief extended to include a stepdaughter's. The third was something less patient. Constance Fairweather had planned carefully and waited carefully and executed carefully. But careful people, in Miss Marple's experience, had a particular vulnerability. They could not easily tolerate the presence of a variable they had not accounted for. Patricia's arrival was a variable. The letters were a variable. Two unaccounted variables in the same afternoon had a tendency to produce movement. She had, accordingly, asked Patricia to stay visible. Patricia had understood without requiring extended explanation. She walked through the village on Saturday morning at a pace that invited observation, to the post office, to the lending library, to the churchyard where her father was buried, and finally to the high street where she stood outside Harlow and Briggs. For 3 minutes looking at nothing in particular, before continuing to Mr. Gale's office, which was closed on Saturdays but had, Miss Marple had noted, Eve's very clear view from the upper window of Fairweather House on the hill. Constance Fairweather came down from the hill at 2:30. Miss Marple was in the lending library, which shared a wall with the post office, and had a window that faced the high street at a useful angle. She was reading a 1952 copy of Country Life, with the contentment of a woman who has arranged her afternoon precisely as she intended. Constance Fairweather was dressed in the morning dress from Harlow and Briggs. She walked with the unhurried ease of a woman on her own ground, which Ashenfield had been, until 48 hours ago, entirely. She went first to the post office, then stood briefly in the high street in the manner of someone scanning a horizon without appearing to scan it. Then she walked toward the churchyard. Patricia was still there. Miss Marple could not observe the meeting directly. She did not need to. She had positioned Clara, who was entirely genuine in her grief for the Colonel, and required no instruction in expressing it, near the churchyard gate, on the pretext of tending the auxiliary's flower arrangement at the War Memorial. Clara observed everything, and would report everything, which she did at 4 o'clock over tea, with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who has sat on committees for 40 years and understands the importance of a complete record. The meeting had lasted 9 minutes. Constance had embraced Patricia. Patricia had received the embrace without returning it, which Constance appeared not to notice, or chose not to. Constance had said she was glad Patricia had come, that there was much to discuss, that they must have dinner, and that this whole terrible business had been such a shock. Patricia had said very little. Constance had mentioned, with careful casualness, that she imagined there was a great deal of paperwork with the estate, and that she had been meaning to sit down with Mr. Gale properly. Patricia had said that yes, she imagined so. Constance had mentioned the letters lightly, briefly, and said how lovely that Reginald had been writing. He had always been better on paper than on the telephone. Patricia had said, yes, he was very specific in writing. He liked to get things down precisely. A pause of Clara estimated approximately 4 seconds. Constance had smiled and said she would telephone about dinner and walked back up the hill. Miss Marple listened to this account without interrupting, and when Clara finished, she poured more tea and said nothing for a moment. 4 seconds, she said at last. At least 4, said Clara. Perhaps 5. She heard it, said Miss Marple. Specific, precisely. She heard exactly what Patricia meant her to hear. She set down her cup, and she is now at home on that hill, working out what is in those letters and how much damage they can do. "What will she do?" said Clara. "Something," said Miss Marple. "Soon. A woman who has waited 11 months for everything to be settled cannot wait indefinitely when the settlement is threatened." She picked up her knitting. "We shall know by Monday, possibly Sunday." She counted her stitches. Outside the evening was soft and the hawthorn very white in the fading light. She was, she thought, almost ready. Chapter 7. The Sunday Removal. The call came at 8:15 on Sunday morning, before the church bells had begun. It was Mr. Gale, telephoning Clara's house with the controlled urgency of a man who has woken to an unwelcome discovery and has spent 30 minutes deciding who to call first. Miss Marple happened to be in the hallway, having come down early for the particular reason that she had not slept well, which in her experience was less a sign of age than of a mind that had found a thread it was not prepared to release until morning made it actionable. She took the receiver from Clara without ceremony. "Miss Marple," said Mr. Gale, "I'm sorry to ring at this hour. I thought you should know immediately. My office was entered last night." Miss Marple said, "The Fairweather file." A pause. "The Fairweather file," he confirmed. "The cabinet was forced. A simple lock, I'm afraid. The building dates from 1903, and security has not kept pace with the architecture. The file containing the amended will and my correspondence with Reginald was removed. Everything else was left undisturbed. Whoever it was knew precisely what they were looking for and precisely where it was kept." "The original will," said Miss Marple, "was a copy held elsewhere?" "I had anticipated that question," said Mr. Gale, with the measured satisfaction of a careful man who has been careful at exactly the right moment. "When I wrote to Patricia on the day after the funeral, I enclosed a certified copy of the amended will. A second certified copy is lodged with my colleague in Chipping Norton, as has been my practice with all significant documents since 1987. The original is gone. The will is not." Miss Marple exhaled. "You have contacted the police?" "Inspector Marsh will be here at 9. He is the sort of man who will treat a break-in to a solicitor's office as a property matter and nothing more, unless someone with sufficient standing suggests otherwise." "I will speak with him," said Miss Marple. She replaced the receiver and stood in the hallway for a moment. The house was quiet around her, the particular Sunday morning quiet of a village moving at half-pace, unhurried and unaware. Through the hallway window she could see Clara's garden in the early light, the apple tree still, the hawthorn hedge casting long soft shadows across the lawn. She had expected something. She had not specified, even to herself, what form it would take. But a woman who has planned with Constance Fairweather's precision does not sit on a hill for 2 days with an unresolved threat and do nothing. The letters were in Patricia's possession and could not easily be reached. The will was in Mr. Gale's office and could. It was the logical move, the removal of the document that proved the estate did not belong to her, in the hope that without it the original arrangement might reassert itself. It was also, Miss Marple reflected, putting on her coat, a mistake. Not because it had failed, though it had failed, thanks to Mr. Gale's professional habits. It was a mistake because it was the first action Constance Fairweather had taken that was not invisible. A natural death leaves no fingerprints. A rinsed glass leaves no fingerprints. A dress commissioned for a London memorial service leaves no fingerprints. A forced lock on a solicitor's office leaves fingerprints of a different kind, not literal ones necessarily, but the unmistakable shape of a person who is frightened and has moved from patience into urgency. Frightened people, in Miss Marple's experience, continued to move. Inspector Marsh was exactly as Mr. Gale had described. A solid, sensible man of 50 who catalogued the damage to the cabinet with conscientious thoroughness and asked the right questions about the wrong assumptions. He was not unintelligent. He was simply, Miss Marple thought, working with an incomplete picture, which is the most dangerous condition for an intelligent person, because their intelligence fills the gaps with the most plausible available material, rather than the correct one. She spoke with him for 11 minutes in Mr. Gale's consulting room, while Mr. Gale sat at his desk and said very little, which was its own form of eloquence. She did not tell Inspector Marsh everything. She told him enough: the dress, the dates, the amended will, the letter Patricia had received, the rinsed glass, Dr. Price's growing unease. And she told it in the plain-spoken, slightly apologetic tone she had cultivated over many decades. The tone that caused people to hear her fully, while simultaneously underestimating how fully they were being directed. By the end of 11 minutes, Inspector Marsh had his notebook open and was writing quickly and had stopped thinking about property crime. "You're suggesting the break-in is connected to the Colonel's death," he said. "I'm suggesting," said Miss Marple, that a woman who would commission a mourning dress 18 days before her husband died is not a woman who breaks into solicitors' offices for unrelated reasons." Inspector Marsh looked at his notebook, then at Mr. Gale, then back at Miss Marple with the expression of a man recalibrating the morning he thought he was going to have. "I'll need to speak with Mrs. Fairweather," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though I would suggest, before you do, that you telephone Dr. Price. He has something he wishes to discuss with a colleague, a medical colleague, specifically regarding cardiac glycosides. I think he would find it easier to discuss it with you first." Marsh wrote that down too. She left him with Mr. Gale and walked out into the Sunday morning. The church bells had begun. Along the high street, Ashenfield's inhabitants were moving in the unhurried Sunday rhythm of people who have not yet understood that their village is no longer quite what it was 24 hours ago. She passed Fairweather House on her way back to Church Lane. She did not look up at the windows. There was no need. She knew, with the particular certainty of someone who has followed a thread to within one turn of its end, that the woman behind those windows had made her last, invisible move. Everything from this point would be visible. She walked on. The bells rang. The morning was very bright and very still, the way English mornings are sometimes in April, just before everything changes. Chapter 8. The Story with One Flaw. Inspector Marsh called on Constance Fairweather at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, which was, Miss Marple reflected when she heard the account afterward, precisely the right time. Early enough that the visit carried official weight. Late enough that Constance had had 2 hours since the church bells began to understand that something was moving toward her, and to arrange herself accordingly. She had arranged herself very well. This was the account as Marsh relayed it to Miss Marple, and Patricia Fairweather at Mr. Gale's office on Sunday afternoon, delivered in the flat, precise tone of a man who has learned to report what he observed without colouring it with what he thought, though what he thought was visible enough underneath. Constance Fairweather had received him in the front sitting-room of Fairweather House, which was tidy and bright and smelled of fresh flowers. She was dressed not in mourning, but in a dark blue wool dress of quiet elegance, which Marsh noted without understanding why he noted it, and which Miss Marple, hearing the description, noted with interest of her own. She had offered tea. She had been composed, cooperative, and had listened to his questions with the expression of a woman who finds the questions puzzling, but is too well-mannered to say so. On the subject of the break-in at Mr. Gale's office, she had expressed genuine seeming shock. She had not, Marsh noted, asked what had been taken. On the subject of her whereabouts on Saturday night, she had been immediate and specific. She had dined alone, read until 10, and retired. Mrs. Tanner did not sleep in the house. She came daily, and Constance had been alone from 6 in the evening. Archie said this without hesitation or elaboration, which was either the confidence of innocence or the confidence of a story rehearsed to the point of naturalness. In Marsh's experience, those two things were not always distinguishable at first listening. On the subject of the amended, Wilshire had shown for the first time something other than composure. Not alarm, it was more careful than alarm. A kind of suspended attentiveness, the stillness of a person receiving information they had expected, but are nonetheless measuring for weight and implication. She had said that she had not been aware of any amendment, and that she was sure there must be some misunderstanding. Her voice throughout this portion had remained even. On the subject of the dress, she had been perfect. Yes, she had commissioned it in March, for a memorial service in London, an old friend of Reginald's, a fellow officer who had died in February. She had left it too long, and her London dressmaker was overwhelmed, and a friend had recommended Harlow and Briggs. She produced, from the bureau drawer, with the unhurried ease of a woman retrieving something ordinary, a card. A printed card from a Mrs. Lavinia Holt of Marylebone, hand-annotated, Memorial St. Giles, March 28th. The handwriting on the annotation was different from the printed card. A personal note, the kind a friend sends with a reminder. Marsh had taken the card. On the subject of Colonel Fairweather's whisky, she had been softly indignant. Reginald had been tired for months. Dr. Price had said so repeatedly, and he had been 63 with a heart condition, and he had been slowing down, in the way men of his constitution slowed down, and it was very painful to hear these suggestions because it implied she had not loved him, and she had loved him very much. She had not cried. Her eyes had been bright in the manner of a woman holding tears at a professional distance, which reads to most observers as dignified grief rather than the management of an instrument. Marsh finished his account. The office was quiet. Patricia said, "The card." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "There was no memorial service on the 28th of March at St. Giles Marylebone," said Patricia. "I checked every London obituary for February and March. The officer she named, a Colonel Bryce Hammond, died in 2019, not this year." Marsh looked at her. "Oh, you checked the obituaries." "I have been checking a great many things from Edinburgh for the past 2 weeks," said Patricia evenly. "Since the morning I received my father's letter." Marsh wrote in his notebook. Miss Marple watched him write and thought about the card in the bureau drawer, retrieved without hesitation, placed there in advance of the visit that Constance had known, from Saturday afternoon's encounter in the churchyard, was coming. The dress explanation had been prepared for weeks, perhaps months. The card was the physical evidence that made it plausible. A forged annotation on a genuine printed card, or a card constructed entirely. Either way, something a careful woman had prepared against the possibility that the dress would one day require explanation. She had prepared for questions about the dress. She had not, apparently, fully prepared for a stepdaughter who had spent a fortnight in Edinburgh systematically verifying every verifiable detail. "The name on the card," said Miss Marple. "Mrs. Lavinia Holt of Marylebone. Has she been contacted?" "I have a constable making inquiries," said Marsh. "As of this morning, no person of that name appears at the Marylebone address on the card." "No," said Miss Marple. "I rather thought not." She looked at her hands, folded in her lap. A woman who plans to the degree Constance Fairweather had planned does not leave a verifiable name on a fabricated card unless the name is unverifiable, unless Mrs. Lavinia Holt is dead, or moved, or never existed, or exists but has no memory of sending such a card, which in itself becomes evidence of fabrication. The dress had been the beginning, and the card was the first unravelling. "There is also," said Miss Marple, "the matter of Dr. Price." Marsh looked up. "He telephoned me this morning, as you suggested. He has spoken with a colleague at the Royal Infirmary in Oxford." A pause. His colleague is of the opinion that the symptoms Reginald described in his letter, progressive fatigue disproportionate to his existing condition, specifically triggered by his evening whisky, are consistent with low-dose chronic administration of a digitalis compound. Digoxin, most probably. He said this in the careful tone of a man laying a stone on a scale and watching it tip. "A post-mortem has been requested. The coroner has authorized it." The room was very quiet. Patricia looked at the window. Her jaw was set in the way of a woman who has been right about something terrible and finds no satisfaction in it. "How long," she said, "before the post-mortem?" "The examination begins tomorrow morning," said Marsh. "We should have preliminary findings by Wednesday." Miss Marple thought about a woman on a hill, in a house that had seemed entirely settled 48 hours ago, who now knew that the solicitor's file was not destroyed, that the letter existed, that the memorial card was being investigated, and that a post-mortem had been authorized. She thought about what a person with that knowledge and that temperament does between Sunday afternoon and Wednesday morning. "Inspector Marsh," she said, "I would suggest that Mrs. Fairweather's movements between now and Wednesday be observed with some care." Marsh met her eyes. "I had already arranged it," he said. It was the first thing he had said that afternoon that gave Miss Marple complete satisfaction. She gathered her bag and rose. Outside, the Sunday afternoon had turned grey. A thin English overcast moving in from the west, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply arrives and settles, and makes everything look as though it has always been that colour. Constance Fairweather had one flaw in her story. That was, in Miss Marple's experience, usually enough. Chapter 9. The Unsurprising Surprise. By Tuesday morning, Constance Fairweather had packed a suitcase, withdrawn £4,000 in cash from the Barclays branch in Chipping Norton, and booked a single seat on the 7:15 from Paddington to Bristol Temple Meads, under the name Mrs. C. Holt. She had not caught the train. Marsh's constable, a young woman named Davies, who had the useful quality of looking entirely unremarkable, while observing everything with considerable precision, had been positioned on Church Lane since Sunday evening, with a clear view of the track leading up to Fairweather House. She had watched the lights in the house until midnight on Sunday, until 10 on Monday, and at 6:15 on Tuesday morning had followed Constance Fairweather's grey Peugeot at a sufficient distance to be invisible and a sufficient closeness to be useful, through 4 miles of empty Cotswold lanes to the Chipping Norton branch of Barclays, where Constance had arrived 12 minutes before opening, and waited in the car with the engine off. Davies had telephoned Marsh from a call box across the street. Marsh had telephoned the station at Paddington. The booking under Mrs. C. Holt had been identified through the Barclays withdrawal. £4,000 in a single transaction flags itself, in ways that a careful woman perhaps ought to have considered. And 2 officers had been positioned at the platform by 6:50. Constance had not reached Paddington. She had turned back at the Chipping Norton roundabout, as though she had thought of something and driven home. Or as though, Davies reported, she had seen something that caused her to change her mind. Though Davies could not identify what. Miss Marple, hearing this at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning in Clara's sitting room with a cup of tea going cold in her hand, thought she could. A woman who has lived for 11 months inside a plan understands, at a cellular level, when the plan has become a trap. Constance Fairweather had built her position on invisibility. Every element had been designed to leave no surface on which suspicion could grip. The natural death, the period of composed bereavement, the estate settling quietly into her hands. Flight destroys that entirely. A widow who runs is not a widow who grieves. A woman who withdraws £4,000 in cash 3 days after a post-mortem is authorised has answered, in the clearest possible terms, the question of whether she believed the post-mortem would find anything. She had turned back because flight, at that precise moment, was a confession. But she had also, Miss Marple noted, packed the suitcase. Which meant she had reached the roundabout and made a calculation, and determined that the risks of staying now equalled or exceeded the risks of running, and had simply been unable to identify a direction in which running led anywhere safe. A woman arriving at that calculation with a packed suitcase and £4,000 in cash and a booked train seat is not a woman who has accepted her situation. She is a woman who has postponed a decision she has already made. "She'll try again," said Patricia. She was seated in Clara's armchair with her father's letter in her coat pocket, where it had remained since Friday. "Won't she? She will consider it," said Miss Marple. "Whether she acts depends on what she concludes the post-mortem will find. If she believes the evidence is insufficient, she may calculate that staying and defending is the stronger position. She has the card, the memorial story, the performance of a bereaved wife, and no direct witness to anything. That is not nothing. It's not enough," said Patricia. "No," said Miss Marple, "but she doesn't know precisely how much we have. She knows about the letter and the will and the card investigation. She does not know what Dr. Price's Oxford colleague said. She does not know the extent of your research into the obituaries." She paused. "She is making calculations with incomplete information, which is a disadvantage but not a fatal one. She is very intelligent." "Intelligent enough to have nearly done it perfectly," said Patricia. The word nearly landed in the room with the quiet force of a word that contains a great deal of effort. "Yes," said Miss Marple simply. The telephone rang at 10:30. It was Marsh. The preliminary post-mortem findings had arrived from Oxford 24 hours ahead of schedule. The pathologist, a doctor, Fenwick, had worked through Monday evening at the request of the coroner, who had communicated the urgency through channels Miss Marple suspected had included a more direct description of the circumstances than was strictly procedurally standard. Dr. Fenwick had found elevated digoxin concentrations in the tissue samples, not acutely elevated, not the concentration of a single large dose, but the residual pattern of chronic low-level administration over a period estimated at 6 to 10 weeks. The Colonel's prescribed medications did not include digoxin. He had no clinical reason to have it in his system at all. Marsh had a warrant. Constance Fairweather was at Fairweather House when Marsh and 2 officers arrived at 11. She answered the door in the dark blue wool dress she had worn on Sunday. The absence of mourning. Black noted by Marsh, and relayed to Miss Marple with the flat precision of a man who now understood what clothing choices signified in this particular case. She had looked at the warrant with an expression that gave nothing away. She had said she would like to telephone her solicitor. Marsh had said, of course, her solicitor was not Mr. Gale. She had, it emerged, retained a firm in Oxford some time in the previous fortnight. She had been, in this as in everything, prepared. She was taken to the station at Chipping Norton at 12 minutes past 11. She walked to the car without assistance and without visible distress, and looked straight ahead throughout the drive, which Davies, who drove, found more unsettling than weeping would have been. And Miss Marple heard all of this at 1 o'clock. She sat with it for a moment, in the way she sat with the end of a complicated pattern row, not triumphantly, not with relief exactly, but with the particular quiet of a mind that has followed a thing to its end and finds the end, however grim, preferable to the alternative. Clara brought soup. Patricia sat without speaking for a long time. She nearly did it, Patricia said again finally. She very nearly did, said Miss Marple, and meant it as neither comfort nor condemnation, but simply as the truth of it. The dress was the error. One cannot commission grief in advance and expect that no one notices the date on the ticket. She picked up her knitting. Outside, Ashenfield went about its Tuesday business in the pale spring light, unhurried and largely uninformed, the way villages do, right up until the moment they understand what has happened among them. That understanding, Miss Marple reflected, would come soon enough. Villages always caught up in the end. Chapter 10. The Last Conversation. Miss Marple left Ashenfield on Thursday morning by the 9:40 bus to Chipping Norton, which connected with the 11:15 to Oxford, and from there to St. Mary Mead by early afternoon. She had packed the previous evening in the unhurried way of a woman who knows exactly what she brought and therefore knows exactly what to return with, and had left Clara's spare room in the condition she always left borrowed rooms, immaculate, impersonal, and containing a small bunch of garden flowers in the bedside glass that she had cut from the garden herself that morning, so that Clara would find something pleasant rather than an absence. Clara had wept slightly at breakfast, which Miss Marple accepted with affectionate practicality and did not encourage. Patricia walked her to the bus stop. They went along Church Lane in the thin Thursday morning, past the hawthorn hedge that had come fully into blossom overnight, white and extravagant in the way hawthorn briefly is before it becomes simply part of the landscape. The village was quiet at this hour. The post office was just opening. A dog of no particular breed investigated the base of the war memorial with professional thoroughness. The air smelled of cut grass and something sweet from the bakery that had not existed since 1947, but whose ghost Miss Marple had always thought lingered pleasantly around that particular stretch of the high street, and they walked without talking for a bit. Patricia had the easy silence of a person who does not feel that quiet requires filling, which Miss Marple appreciated. "She'll plead not guilty," said Patricia as they came in sight of the bus stop. "Her solicitor was on the radio this morning, described it as a deeply troubling miscarriage." "Yes," said Miss Marple. She will plead not guilty, and the trial will be thorough and difficult, and the outcome, given the post-mortem findings and the letter and the card and Mr. Gale's testimony, will, I think, not be in serious doubt. Though serious doubt is precisely what her solicitor will attempt to manufacture. She paused. It will be unpleasant for you. I know, said Patricia. I've known that since the morning the letter arrived. She said it without self-pity, as in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has looked at a hard road, measured it, and chosen to walk it anyway. They reached the bus stop. Miss Marple set her bag down and looked along the lane in the direction the bus would come, a habit rather than a necessity, since the bus was not due for 12 minutes. "Can I ask you something?" said Patricia. "Of course. When did you know? Not suspect. No." Miss Marple considered this with the seriousness it deserved, because it was a genuine question, and Patricia was a person who would recognize a simplified answer and did not deserve one. "The churchyard," she said at last, "Saturday afternoon, when Clara told me about the 4 seconds. She saw Patricia's expression and continued, "It was not the pause itself. A guilty woman and an innocent woman might both pause upon hearing the word specific and precisely used in that particular way. The difference was what came after the pause. An innocent woman, upon realizing that the words might carry an implication she hadn't intended, would clarify. She would say something, even something small, a laugh, a correction, a deflection. Constance Fairweather said nothing. She simply smiled and moved on. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Because she knew exactly what I meant." "Because she knew exactly what you meant," said Miss Marple. "And because a woman who has lived for 11 months inside a secret has learned that the safest response to ambiguity is no response at all. It is a disciplined habit. And discipline, in my experience, is easier to maintain than to conceal, particularly under pressure. One sees the mechanism underneath." The bus appeared at the end of the lane, working its way around the long curve from the direction of Bourton, with the unhurried reliability of a village bus that has never seen reason to rush. "What happens to Gilbert?" said Miss Marple. "The Colonel's spaniel." She had thought of him on and off since she arrived. "I'm keeping him," said Patricia. "He's coming to Edinburgh." A pause. "He seems to understand something has changed. He's been sitting outside my father's study door each morning." "Dogs generally do understand," said Miss Marple, "more than is comfortable to acknowledge." The bus drew up. The driver, a young man with a cheerful indifference to the scenic splendour of the Cotswolds, through which he had driven for 3 years, opened the door without cutting the engine. Miss Marple picked up her bag. Patricia held out her hand, and then, with a slight awkwardness that was entirely genuine, changed the gesture into something closer to an embrace, brief and firm, the embrace of a woman who is not demonstrative, but has decided that the occasion warrants it. "Thank you," said Patricia, "for noticing the dress." "I notice a great many things," said Miss Marple. "Most of them are of no consequence whatsoever. One must simply be patient until the consequential ones appear." She patted Patricia's arm once, lightly. "Look after the dog, and yourself, which I imagine you are rather better at than most people give you credit for." She boarded the bus, found her seat on the left side. She preferred the left on this route, having no idea what the route looked like, but preferring as a general principle to face the direction of movement with a view of the hedgerows. She settled her bag on her lap. She did not look back as the bus pulled away, not from coldness, but from the same instinct that keeps her from watching the end of things too long. The end had been reached. What mattered now was already in motion, in the hands of Inspector Marsh, and Dr. Fenwick, and Mr. Gale, and the law, and Patricia, who was more than capable. The Cotswolds rolled past the window, very green and very still, the villages giving way to farmland, and back to villages in the unhurried repetition of the English countryside that has never found any particular reason to arrange itself differently. Miss Marple took out her knitting. She calculated, enough wool to finish the row by Oxford, and she had been working on this particular pattern since before she came to Ashenfield, and it had survived the journey in excellent condition, a little further along than when she arrived, the shape of it clearer now than it had been, each stitch in its right place. She counted carefully, as she always did, and began.